Content warning. The following episode contains discussion of suicide and self-harm. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to our Surviving Social Isolation podcast. My name is Stephanie.
And my name is Haley. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about social isolation and how it affects the individual as well as communities. Hi, welcome back to episode 2. We are going to today be talking about the effects of social isolation. We're going to be talking about how social isolation impacts us as individuals, and how we interact with ourselves and interact with the world. How are you, Steph?
I'm good. I'm pretty good.
Yeah, so I think maybe a good place to start this episode is to just give like a quick and concise definition of what social isolation is. So if you have one, do you have a quick, concise definition, Steph?
I think for this episode and for our following ones, social isolation would be an inability to have a physical and or mental connection within communities.
And I think it's important to emphasize the importance of both physical and like mental and emotional connections. There is a lot of research that basically suggests if you think you're alone and you feel like you're alone, it is just as harmful, if not more harmful, than actually being alone.
What I want to start with is a little social experiment.
Ooh.
So Harry Frederick Harlow was an American psychologist, and he's best known for his maternal separation, his dependency needs, and social isolation experiments, especially on monkeys. So to study his theory, he had 2 different forms of experiments. Today, we're just going to be talking about the infant monkey reared in isolation.
Okay.
So a very controversial experiment, and it's from the 1950s. This explored social isolation by separating baby monkeys from their mothers and then placing them in a pit of despair. And yeah, so the babies couldn't climb out. It was just them in this metal container. And some babies were kept isolated for 3 months, some for 6, some for 9, and some for even 1 year. Then he put them back with the other monkeys. And this was to show the effects of their lack of attachment on behavior. So what do you think happened?
Ooh, there's probably some long-term effects because those are, especially if they're really young, those windows cover a lot of developmental stages, which basically means that being socially isolated could actually affect how your brain develops. And therefore could permanently alter how you interact with others, how you interact with yourself, what you view as safe versus dangerous, all that kind of stuff. So probably some depression. And I don't necessarily think like aggression, but definitely like resource guarding. So like being more focused on like serving the self and protecting food, water, safety for the self rather than like for the group.
You're not very far. So what the results was monkeys engaged in behaviors such as clutching their own bodies and rocking compulsively. So like that back and forth. The babies were then scared of other monkeys and they became aggressive towards them. So because they weren't able to form those bonds and learn how to socialize, they're unable to communicate and socialize with different communities, different species, different monkeys. And the babies actually began to tear their hair out, scratch, and bite themselves.
Oh, babies.
I know. And like you said, for the length of isolation, Harlow reported that the effects of 6 months of total social isolation were so devastating and deliberating that we'd assume initially that 12 months of isolation would not produce any additional decrement. But this assumption proved to be false because 12 months of isolation almost obliterated the animal socially. So any babies that were left there for the 1 year, it was just horrible.
Oh my Lord.
I know.
That's so
It's
stressful.
super intense, right? And like obviously this is a very controversial experiment because of animal rights and also the
And just
ethical standards of an
ethics.
experiment.
Yeah, just
Exactly.
ethics as a concept.
Right? But I don't think we're too far off for what we do in society.
Yeah. Well, even just like if we look at we look at the so in that study they had the time stamps, you got your
Mhm.
3 months, your 6 months, your 12 months, whatever.
Yeah.
If we take that and we, for example, look at COVID and we consider all of the babies that were born during COVID, which is actually like a pretty high number.
So
Like
many.
so many babies. But yeah, but it's like if you think about it, it's like you've got, because of how long we've been in lockdown, and yeah, there's a little bit of, I think, wiggle room because they've got their parents and any other like siblings or relatives that live
Mhm.
in the house. Like what is that going to do? Like what is the COVID generation going to look like in 15 years? Because in 15 years they're going to be, kind of edging towards adulthood, and it's sort of like, what are we going to see as a society taking place like within that demographic?
It's like our attachment theory, right? Like when we
Yeah.
are young, it's so important. And for a lot of these babies, it's like 1 year. And then all of a sudden, bam, there's these
Yeah.
random people that you're supposed to have a connection with. And you're like,
Yeah,
I
there's
don't
and
know
it's
who
and it's
you
not
are.
even it's not even just like, oh, there's suddenly more people. There's
Mhm.
suddenly all of the people. Because at one, you don't necessarily have like a formed personality, a formed like conscience
It's a little
necessarily.
bulby,
You're still,
like,
yeah, you're still very much a baby, but it is sort of like, oh, like it's like, ooh, things are happening and they're extreme and don't make any sense.
for sure.
Yeah, so like that's, I'm interested to see the long run repercussions of this.
I agree.
I think a really interesting um, point of this is like that study really talks about the repercussions of social isolation kind of around the ideas of development. So it focuses on
Mhm.
like babies and growing up and how the brain prepares itself for community, prepares itself for socialization, all that stuff. I actually found a study by Bruce Argo and Jennifer Bollock. They basically did like a meta-analysis. So they collected a bunch of other studies, and they actually looked at the effects of social isolation in prisoners. So the use of solitary confinement as like a punishment and the psychological effects that kind of come out of that practice.
And truly, that's the pit of despair, right? Like you
Absolutely,
can't get out.
completely. Yeah. And so they quoted a study done in 2006 by, I don't know, Hanny. I can't remember his first name. But it basically was talking about the effects of long-term social isolation. So basically 12 to, I think it was 18 months of pure social isolation. So your food is brought to you, you don't see anyone,
Mhm.
there's no mental stimulus, like there's no games, there's no books, there's no nothing, you just sit in a cell that is like basically long enough for you to lie down in, and that's it, and there's maybe a
Mhm.
little window, that's all you get. But so they basically found that you know the longer people were in these um in these long-term social isolation situations, keeping in mind they're not, when they say long term they mean like a minimum of 4 months. Anything like, at one point they talk about short-term isolation and they're like, yeah, 60 days. Like, that's
60 days.
what?
Wow.
Like 60
Wow.
days is not a short amount of time, my dude. Yeah, anyway, just think that's worth noting.
60
um
days was short term.
so I'll jump to that real quick. They basically said that the psychological deterioration, specifically among Canadian prisoners, that's important because this cannot be applied to American prisons because American prisons are run differently. But the psychological deterioration among Canadian prisoners who spent 60 days in administrative segregation is what it's called, had no noteworthy evidence of there was no noteworthy evidence of psychological deterioration. 60 days. Excuse me?
Yeah,
Like, that's short. We're
I
not we're not
yeah,
strong.
that's a head tilt. That
Sure. So yeah, that's an interesting little note. Anyways, um, but so the in their long-term things, so in their
Mhm.
in situations of long-term isolation, they found a couple of things. I wonder if you can guess what they are.
I'm surprised they found some things after, right? And so
Yeah.
long term, would that be
Long-term is basically like 90 days to like 18 months
yeah.
in pure social isolation. And not even just social isolation as in you don't get to see people, social isolation as in you don't even have books or television or
Oh
music.
my gosh.
Yeah, it's rough.
The first thing that kind of pops up, I'm thinking with a withdrawal from society, a lot of depression, but also a lot of anger. I think
Yeah,
maybe some hostility.
yeah.
So tell me what happened.
Well, so they found the classic depression, anxiety, and
Hmm.
mood regulation problems. They also found psychosis, so like
Hmm.
hallucinations
I'm
and
sure.
completely detaching from reality, suicidal behavior, and self-mutilation.
Wow.
Like the brain literally is like, I need something to do. And so it just attacked itself for a
Yeah.
thing to do.
And that's the response to survive.
It's absolutely, it's that whole thing of like, I got to make myself feel something
Yeah.
because I can't handle feeling nothing. Yeah. And the study kind of goes on to talk about how social contact and social interaction really helps ground individuals in their environment. It helps them understand what is and isn't real.
Hmm.
And so again, that kind of goes into this whole psychosis thing where people who are really alone for a long time just kind of they lost it, they were just
Yeah.
they they were, they thought certain things were happening, they were afraid of certain things, they were reacting to certain things, and everyone's like, dude, you're sitting in a box, nothing's happening, you're fine. Even though you're not fine
You're
because that's
not. Yeah.
cruel and unusual punishment. But I actually think that point, at least for me, I think that's really relatable to the pandemic because I don't know about you, I lost sense of time.
I used to be late for things. I'm even more late for
Oh
things
yeah.
now. I
I literally would just be like, "Oh, I'm supposed to do this at this time on a Tuesday." And I would, I'd be fully ready and be like, "Yeah, let's go." And then somebody be like, "You realize that that's 5 days away. And also, you're supposed to meet at 1. It's currently 11 p.m. Like, what do you I don't understand what you think is happening here." I totally lost track of like concepts that are not clearly tangible. So yeah, time. Yeah. So reading
yeah,
that was really interesting because I was sort of like, oh yeah, I was like, been there.
totally agree. And something that stuck out for me is like during the pandemic is being isolated from my friends and like physically isolated from my friends and socializing with other people. I definitely became a lot more anxious and reading into things that I don't know if I would if I was in
Right.
person.
Right. Like you almost became like hyper vigilant.
For sure.
Yeah.
And it drove me crazy. Oh,
Well, but I mean, like that makes sense because I think, I remember, earlier in the pandemic, there were all of these we're going to call them slogans because I don't know what else to call them. There were a bunch of different slogans that were like, we're all in this together,
yeah.
and like rest if you need to. And the one that I think really like resonated in my, like deep in my soul that I really held on to was the like, this is a survival mode event where like you don't have to be productive, you don't have to accomplish anything
Hmm.
because the reality is we are all just trying to survive.
Yeah.
um and I think maybe the person who made that slogan was really like, oh well, you just don't want to get sick, you don't want to end up in the hospital and then die from COVID. But it's also like, okay, if we consider the effects and the implications of social isolation, and we consider the fact that we as human beings are social creatures, and for our own functionality and our own quality of life, we need social interaction. It's like, yeah, even just not seeing my friends, even just
Hmm.
not being able to like hug my parents, like those things are
Huge.
survival moments where it's
Yeah.
sort of like, oh, and yeah, and I thought that was just like a really interesting, I guess, slogan. Again, I don't know if that's the right word, but
Yeah, it works.
it worked.
And as we talk about this, like we clearly can see social isolation for monkeys, social isolation for prisoners, and social isolation for us.
Yeah.
All the impacts and effects were pretty similar.
Yeah, they overlap in ways that I like wasn't expecting, but was also not surprised by.
Yeah.
Because it is very interesting to hear that, like, when social isolation happens at a young age during development, you get these long-term effects that are like, you know, depression and anxiety, but also just like not really knowing how to interact with the people around you. And then when it happens later in life, it's the same thing, but like acute. Like
Mhm.
it's like the very like, head of a pin kind of moment where it's like, yeah, those are the same things, just like small scale.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Surviving Social Isolation. We have some questions for our listeners. So going forward, each episode is going to have a thought-provoking question. So our question for this week is, was there any notable change that you noticed during social isolation? Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for hanging out. I'm Haley.
I'm Stephanie.
And we will see you next week. Bye.